welcome to each of you as we study today Psalm 61. Psalm 61, I'm still thinking of where we finished yesterday with Psalm 60, and I made mention that there's often a universal dimension of Psalms. So I want to continue to explain a little more, and it's not so clear. A universal dimension of Psalms as understood by the classic commentators. Now, when we say the classic commentators, probably among the earliest is Rashi, who lived in France, 1040 to 1105. About the same time as Rabbi David Kimchi, living in also in France. Ibn Ezra, Avraham ibn Ezra is about the same time, and as the other two. And then later in the Middle Ages, a number of others like the Meiri. So for context, the readers of the Psalms throughout our community were living in diaspora. They were living, longing for a return to the land of Israel, to Jewish independence and dignity. And so our prayers, my morning prayers today, had as the centerpiece the Amidah. And the Amidah prayer, said 3 times a day, composed by the rabbis just after the destruction of the temple, is really a blueprint for bringing redemption, for bringing the Jews back to the land of Israel and sovereignty. But what is distinctive about the prophets and distinctive about the rabbis and their understanding of that trajectory is that the future is a Messianic future. Not only will the Jews be brought back to sovereignty and rebuild a temple to be close to God, but that will be a harbinger for world peace, that Israel will be a light to the nations. And the rabbis will debate this messianic future. Some, like Nachmanides in Spain in the 13th century, for him, it will be a transformation of nature itself. So when it says the lion will lay with the lamb, he takes, or the wolf will lay with the lamb, he takes that literally, that there will be a transformation in nature and harmony will reign. For Maimonides, taking that same line, he will see it as only a metaphor for mighty nations will be at coexistence with weaker nations. For Maimonides, the Messianic era will be natural. It'll be where the philosopher is the king who will inspire a world of harmony. But what is in common, and I mention that because it's important always to know that there are these natural continuums of understanding big concepts like the world to come, the Messianic era. So what they do share in common is that the Messiah, one other thing they will differ on is the nature of the Messiah himself, in whether he will be an individual king. Maimonides will say he will be a king who will live and he will die. He will be immortal. For Nachmanides, there's the supernatural dimension. And for the mystics, the Messiah is simply the gathering of the sparks, the Humpty Dumpty sparks, with the fall of the Garden of Eden, and that the Messiah will be the reconstituting of the original Adam, who had fallen from the heights of spiritual wholeness. So different understandings, but here's what they do link, and this is now to come back to the Psalm by way of introduction. And that is the Messiah is identified with King David as a model king. For some, literally. For some, it's the man and his progeny. For others, he's simply an archetype. And on this Veterans Day, he's the archetype of soldier poet, soldier, sweet singer to God. And the Psalms, the 150 Psalms, with 74 of them attributed to David, he becomes the soldier who united the tribes for the first time, creating that sense of dignity and strength that would allow his son Solomon to build the first temple, a symbol of celebrating closeness to God. And so the rabbis will have a line in the Talmud. It's not in the Torah. It's not in the Mishnah. It's already in the latter conversations of the rabbis. Talmud being edited in Baghdad in about the year 500, composed in many ways of conversations of earlier rabbis, including rabbis in Israel. And there will be the following line that we all know. Here's a piece of Talmud you all know by heart. David Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai V'Kayam. David Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai V'Kayam. And I've never learned the hand signals well. But what those words mean are, David Melech Yisrael, David is the king of Israel. Chai, he lives. Chai Chai V'Kayam, he lives, may he endure. So that's a song that we sing without thinking about it. That's a celebration of kingship, and as if the trajectory is indefinite. David may be long gone, but yet we learn and sing a song in celebration that is messianic. That's again the obsession of the Jewish people. Every time we pray, a trajectory forward to a time of redemption, seeing God as a necessary vehicle for that redemption, but we're still, if you will, essential. God may be the vehicle, but we're driving. We got to put our foot on the pedal. It's a partnership. And that also is the theme throughout Psalms. We have to wait for God, but when God comes, we got to be there to, again, put the foot on the pedal. And so with that, Psalm 61, I've entitled, Enthroned Forever Before God, from the closing lines of this psalm. Listen to the two of the three closing lines, and I'll put it up in a moment, but I'm still kind of getting a running start for a very short psalm. Days upon days for the king may you add. May his years be as many generations. May he be enthroned forever before God. Kindness and truth apportion, that they may preserve him. So again, David Melech Yisrael, Chai V'Kayam. And indeed, we will have images of that echoing here in this psalm for David. With that, let me put up the psalm and then talk a little afterwards, talk a little bit about some of the artistic weave, the repetition of words. I will just highlight before I begin to read that this psalm is split in half. If you don't count verse 1 or see it as only an introduction, you have 4 verses, 2 to 5 that are a request, and then verses 6 to 9, which is focused on the monarchy. Once again, even though this is called a Psalm of David, we don't know if it was written by David or if it's written and it's in reference to David, written at a later time, David again being the image of the ideal king. Psalm 61, enthroned enduringly before God, for the conductor on the Ginat of David. Hear, God, my song, attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth, to you I call when my heart is faint. To a rock that is high above me, lead me. For you were a refuge for me, a tower of strength in the face of the enemy. May I dwell in your tent forever. May I take refuge in the cover of your wings, Selah. For you, God, have heard my vows. You have granted an inheritance to those that fear your name. Days upon days for the king may you add. May his years be as many generations. May he be enthroned enduringly before God. Kindness and truth, chesed ve'emet, a portion that they may preserve him, so that I may sing praise of your name forever, that I may fulfill my vows each day. And you can see when it shifts to talking about the king in the third person, verse 7 and 8, may he be enthroned enduringly before God in verse 8, it leaves the question, is David singing of himself in the third person? Possibly, though more likely it's being sung about him or another king. And in my letter of introduction to the psalm today, I emphasized that commentators will focus on the importance of stability of government, of an enduring king for the people to prosper. Some of the things now to point out structurally, and that is verse 2, and I mentioned that it's divided from 2 to 5 and then 6 to 9. Both have the word listen. Shim'ah, that's the opening word of verse 2 here. And you get that parallel in the fourth word in Hebrew on verse 6, Shemata. So the two sections have a key verb drawing on God to pay attention and to listen. And while I'm on verse 6, that's again the second half. For you, God, have heard my vows. That's in the past tense. And that opens the second stanza. And you will see that same image in the concluding verse, which is, so that I may fulfill my vows each day, which is in the future tense. But the key word here is vow. And so there will be reoccurring words that are, if you will, part of the weave of the psalm. In verse 2, here God, most translations translate rinati as my cry. And they'll do so, they'll say, because of context. But usually, Rina, like if you know it's an Israeli name today, Rina, is a song of celebration. I left it more neutral in my translation. Initially, I did it, Hear God, my exuberant song, but I left it neutral because the transition will be to struggle. So, Hear God, my song, attend to my prayer. And here's a king seemingly, or at least understood, as David at war. And that links it to yesterday's psalm. Remember, in the opening of Psalm 60, David is in the midst of battles all around, and some outside the borders of Israel, into what today would be Jordan. And so from the end of the earth, which some of the classic commentators understand is the continuum, as if David is fighting on the other side of the Dead Sea. So from all places, now I'll start again, that's the commentary, but of course it's not the only way to understand it. From the end of the earth, to you I call when my heart is faint. To a rock that is high above me, lead me. And here's a word play. A rock that is high above me can either refer to God, for God, one of the reoccurring names of God in the Bible, particularly in Psalms, is Tsur, rock, that which is strong, steady. You can, a big shield. It's also potentially high. So you can see this as a capital R. To a rock that is high above me, lead me. Lead me to you, you who are my refuge. Verse 4, for you, now addressing God again, this is I and you. In the first, 1 through 5 in particular, it's talking directly to God. For you, and whenever it's for, verse 4 and verse 6 begin with the word key. And both of those verses refer to an event of the past that gives one confidence. For you were a refuge for me, a tower of strength in the face of the enemy. And now in the present future, the imperfect, may I dwell in your tent forever. May I take refuge in the cover of your wings. Again, the repetition of the word refuge, Selah. And that ends the first stanza. Here, again, reference to the past to give confidence, to identify God as the source of support. Instead of, verse 6, again, is past tense. So there's this going back and forth. For you, God, have heard my vows. And vows here is a technical term. A neder, not unlike Kol Nidre, the prayer of Yom Kippur, is a vow, but of a technical of a particular kind, usually. It's usually in reference to a vow to God, a vow to make an offering. You have granted an inheritance to those that fear your name. And I like the word inheritance here poetically, in that it again conveys a quality of a familial relationship with God. And not using God's name, but we often see Shemecha, your name, as a substitute for saying God. And more specifically, Shemecha is for the intimate name, the Yud He Vav He. This psalm will have Elohim, God's name, 3 times. Those are the generic name for God, as in verse 6. But at the end of verse 6, your name is the intimate name of relationship with God, the Yud He Vav He. And now shifting to verses 7 and 8, to it being a royal psalm, to focus on the need for both government stability, but more a longer potential trajectory. Days upon days. And here you're going to get these repeated images of the repeating of days. You'll also see it as the 2 last words on verse 9. So yamim is plural for days. Al yamei, yamim al yamei is similar to yom yom. And in verse 7, dor vador, from generation to generation, or as many generations. So 7, 8, and 9 are focused on the trajectory enduringly forward. Days upon days for the king, may you add. May his years be as many generations. Yoshev olam, may he be enthroned. Olam is another word for time. Enduringly, lifnei Elohim, before God. And chesed ve'emet, man yinetzaruhu, kindness and truth, man, translated as a portion, that they may preserve him. 2 thoughts. And that is what gives continuity to a king, which is constantly emphasized in Torah, are chesed ve'emet, kindness and truth. Yesterday we saw a version of emet on the flag, on the banner of Israel. Chesed ve'emet is often the two qualities identified with God, that God is kind, and it's a kindness that many of the commentators identify and link to the covenant, that it's the fulfillment of covenant that is the quality of kindness. And emet can mean reliable, or as we saw yesterday, or trustworthy, underscoring that the ability to hear truth, to speak truth, is an essential identity of God, and it is an essential ingredient of God's kingship and more. For a human king, the prayer that will allow endurance is kindness and truth. And the rabbis do a wordplay with the word man. Here it's translated, as it's often translated, as to divide or portion, that they may preserve him. Again, it's kindness and truth that preserve the king. But the wordplay that you get in the rabbinic midrash is man is also manna, the food, the nourishment for the Israelites in the desert. That what is it that will, if you will, sustain, nourish the king's longevity? It's kindness and truth. That alone, this is a beautiful poetic wordplay for conveying what is essential. And then the last is Cain. That's the first time it appears. And Cain is, kind of like, may it be so. Cain means literally yes, like proclaiming, in reference to this prayer for the king's longevity, yes, may it be so. And what we've seen is a recurring theme, that the goal of the psalmist is ultimately to praise God, to be in service to God, to worship God. May it be that the king has longevity so that I may sing praise of your name forever. La'ad, another word related to time. L'shalmi nidari, so that I may fulfill my vows yom yom, each day. And as I noted, the word neder appeared earlier, but in the quality of I've made vows to you, let me fulfill those vows in the future. And so to pull this psalm together for today, this is a royal psalm. It's a psalm that celebrates kingship on Veterans Day. It does so in the context of acknowledging the need for strength, the need to take on, as in verse 4, strength in the face of an enemy, because we do live in a world in which there is always the possibility of war, of danger. It is sad but real that fighting is at times part of our world. And David becomes an exemplar of fighting. And like any fighter, as we've seen in some of that history of David, it's kind of a mixed experience in terms of quality of ruthlessness at times. But bracketing and putting that aside, there's the image of God's protective wings in verse 5, that God gives shelter, that God gives the ability to rise to higher heights, and to do so feeling as if kings can thereby endure imitating God, namely with chesed ve'emet, with kindness and truth, sustaining a king, in order that there is stability, and stability enables the temple, stability enables worship, and stability enables the fruition of what is possible in the best of humanity in the trajectory of a messianic future. And I'll just pull it together with where I started. And that is in Greek thought, as Rabbi Harold Schulweis taught In Greek thought, the world was circular in terms of history. It was a return season to season. For the rabbis, history was a spiral, returning and rising, with God as creator promising the fulfillment of creation, which was an enduring world of stability, which for the rabbis was symbolized by an enduring reign of a model king, a Messianic king, often identified with King David, as in this psalm. So with that, as a sharing of Psalm 61, Enthroned forever before God on this Veterans Day, in which we again pause to acknowledge those who have served our country and served us and still do to protect us. Any thoughts about Psalm 61?
Rabbi, it's
Yes,
Mimi.
Mimi, good to
Mimi,
hear you.
Yeah. First of all, I want to introduce all of you to my friend Judy Castle from Flint.
Oh, welcome, Judy.
Yeah, Judy's the ritual chair at our synagogue there, and we've known each other for more than 60 years. That's first of all. And secondly, I have a question, and that in verse 9,
Yes.
L'shalmei, is that the same root as shalom, just without the vav?
So
You use it as fulfill, or is it a different word?
well, the same letters, and in Hebrew, there's kind of the magic.
Shorish.
So lishalem as a verb can mean to pay, to repay, to fulfill.
Oh, okay.
So in modern Hebrew, the shalem is to pay. And
Okay.
in this context of vows, it's to fulfill or to pay up one's vows.
Mm-hmm.
But it's related to shalom in terms of, if you will, peace is when everything is paid up, when there are no
Okay.
more accounts to settle, then there is peace. And so in terms of a root, in Hebrew, words have a 3-consonant stem. Shalom and shalem are related, the same 3 consonants, shin, lamed, mem. Any other thoughts or reactions today to Psalm 61? Go ahead, Arnold.
Yeah, you had mentioned early on that there's some ambiguity in the psalm, whether the psalmist is praying for, quote, a good king to live long and reign long, or whether he is praying for a good king in the time of perhaps what the chroniclers identified as an evil king, king that did not walk with God.
Yeah.
I thought I was just attracted by that ambiguity.
And so again, what is remarkable about Psalms as religious literature, authorship is the great ambiguity. And it's meaning that because the very nature of a religious poem or prayer is it's not about the one writing it, it's about what's being expressed to God. So the first reaction in terms of that comment, Arnold, is that there's this implicit ambiguity in the psalm itself in terms of its historical context and setting. But what is unambiguous is the nature of the king sought. And that's chesed ve'emet, a king who will endure because of kindness and truth. So those, in that regard, in terms of bad kings and good kings, clearly what is sought is a king that reflects God's way, which is understood consistently as chesed ve'emet, kindness and truth. One closing thought or comment? I have 2. Marvin and then Hal, and then we'll pull this together. Go ahead, Marvin. You have to unmute. You still have to unmute, Marvin. You got it, Marvin. You got to hit like your space bar or the red to unmute. Okay, Marvin, while you figure it out, because you're not unmuted.
Sorry.
There you go. Got it. Go ahead, Marvin.
Yeah, but I'm not seeing you or anything. I've got to get back. Just a minute.
Okay,
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, Marvin.
And there are so many names for God
Yes.
that have been used. And one of the questions that I have here, for instance, is in verse 4, verse 3, you lead me to a rock, and you indicated that rock is a synonym for God in this place over here.
Yes.
I'm wondering, is that a universally accepted kind of a definition of that word? And if so, two questions. And if so, why in English are these words not capitalized?
So it's not the only way it's used here. It's like Rock of Ages, let our song, right? So Rock of Ages in the Hanukkah song, also sung in churches. Rock there refers to God.
Yes.
And it's consistent that it is a name for God. But here in verse 3, it can either refer literally to a rock, a place of protection, or it can be metaphorical, or if you will, a name of God. So in that sense, it's ambiguous. Here's one quick story in that regard, Marvin. When the Declaration of Independence of Israel was being written by Ben-Gurion, there was a divide whether God's name should be mentioned or not to thank God for the return to Israel. And the secular political parties said, this is a secular state, not a theocracy, no name for God. And so in the Declaration of Independence, written and proclaimed in Tel Aviv, they put in the word Sur Yisrael, the rock of Israel, which was ambiguous. So the secular could say, well, that's just referring to the strength of Israel. And the religious could say that's referring to the God of Israel.
God of Israel.
So that is how it got finessed in Israel's Declaration of Independence. They used the word Sur because of the ambiguity. So with that, let me give Hal the last comment for today, and then You're welcome, Marvin. Go ahead, Hal. Also, go ahead, Hal.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask a question about the continuity of the Psalms, which we've been reading one a day. Unlike an epic poem in which there's a theme developed one verse after another, and in development of themes in an epic poem, but here in the Psalms we don't have a kind of continuity. We have like Psalm 59, which is about hungry dogs, and then this one, which is rather peaceful all the way through. Why couldn't they be switched? Why couldn't this psalm be in a different place in the numerology of these psalms? You understand what I'm saying here?
I do, Hal, and it's an interesting question. What I hear you asking is, what is the weave of how the psalms have been chosen in terms of the ordering of psalms, and why isn't there seemingly a greater, if you will, flow from psalm to psalm? In fact, it can be so jarring between, let me bathe my feet in the blood of my enemies, to this kind of psalm, which is, more neutral about enemies, and it's more about God, and it'll flip back and forth. What I have seen addressed in my preparations is sometimes psalms will be linked. So Psalm 60 and 61. 60 was in the midst of battle yesterday, may have even been after losing a battle. And some will then say, well, Psalm 61 is the next moment, and that's after victory. So now David has proven victorious, and he's saying, may my victory, may my kingship endure. So that's an attempt, if you will, to draw a line between psalms. But often that line is not evident. And what I haven't seen, though it would be an interesting doctoral dissertation, if I wanted to do a doctoral dissertation on Psalms, which is an aside is what Harold Kushner did his doctoral dissertation on, which was Psalms. I'll have one added comment because Hal and Julia are literature professors. I once had the privilege to talk to Harold Kushner, and he's about his undergraduate studies. And he said he started as a psychology major, but he found that if he really wanted to understand the inner life of people, he was better off switching to literature. And that's what he did, becoming a literature major instead. So back to the question of Hal, and that is, I haven't seen, for instance, in Benjamin Siegel, who does a great job showing the literary structure of Psalms, I haven't seen him address the literary choices of how the 150 were put together and the trajectory. It's a very interesting question, and one that I'll continue to hold as we continue to read and move forward. So a closing comment: tomorrow has a greater possibility of stillness. Psalm 62, a phrase that gets repeated twice, the only phrase to be repeated twice: only through God is my spirit still, or is there stillness for my spirit? So tomorrow, maybe moving on from the victory of Psalm 61, though there's a little bit more war tension in it. With that, we conclude each day with the Kaddish, as the Kaddish was originally composed at the end of study as a recitation of hope. If there's any among us who are in mourning or are having yurtzeit to honor a loved one, I invite you to join with me. I, as my mindset on this Veterans Day, bring to mind those who've sacrificed on behalf of our nation. Yitkadal, Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah,
Amen.
V'alma divra kirute, v'yamlich malchute, b'chayechon u'vyomechon, uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru, Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabba mevarach, le'olam olmei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekucha berichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata damiran bi'alma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya V'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Osei shalom b'romav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. Thank you, each of you, for giving context for my own study. I wish all of you a Veterans Day of appreciating the gifts of America. And may it be a time of stability.